began to contemplate evacuation. The burning question was, who goes? And who gets left behind? I borrowed a truck, and I basically sent the signal to my folks. And this meant a group of South Vietnamese majors, lieutenant colonels, and their families to muster at an address in downtown Saigon. I drove down there, they loaded up onto the truck, and I drove them to the airbase. I had told them, when you hear 3 thumps, that means hold the babies' mouths, don't breathe, don't talk, don't make any noise, because we're going through the gate post. I saluted in uniform as a captain of the United States Army. The guard waved me through, and I drove straight out to the flight line to an aircraft that was awaiting. One Vietnamese colonel that was putting his family on the plane, he had wanted to stay in Vietnam to defend the country. And this full colonel had like 8 kids and a wife. And he was in tears. The family were in tears. And I said to him, get on the plane. Just go. Go. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible moral dilemma for everybody.
We today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam. We have adopted a plan for the complete withdrawal of all U.S. combat ground forces. We are finally bringing American men home.
We who made the agreement thought that it would be the beginning not of peace in the American sense, but the beginning of a period of coexistence, which might evolve, as it did in Korea, into 2 states. Reconciliation between North and South Vietnam, we knew would be extremely difficult. But I was hopeful.
Because of the Paris Agreement, American soldiers were going home. But I was on my way back to Vietnam. I was assigned to Saigon in the first week of August 1973, so about 6 months after the ceasefire. I would say that between the State Department people and CIA people, the contractors who were there to maintain infrastructure, maintain aircraft, as well as people like me, we had 5,000 to 7,000 Americans in country. A lot of the guys had Vietnamese girlfriends and wives, in many cases with children. In general, things were eerily calm and in many ways normal in Saigon.
My sense was that we were going to be there, pretty much for a long time to come. I was assigned to the American Embassy in Saigon. I was in charge of the 84 Marine security guards that were there, making sure that they kept up with their physical fitness training. We were there to protect American lives as well as American property. It was just day-to-day job.
The ambassador there was a guy named Graham Martin, a North Carolinian, just as I was. He spoke with a slow Southern drawl. He was a great gentleman. He was a cold warrior in the old stripe. He'd lost an adopted son in Vietnam to combat. And he was not going to give up South Vietnam to the communists. He was determined to keep U.S. aid flowing into Saigon. When the ceasefire occurred in 1973, everybody toasted it with Bloody Marys in the U.S. Embassy. It was a grand party. We thought peace was at hand. But the Paris Peace Accord was a masterpiece of ambiguity.
In order to get President Thieu and the South Vietnamese to go along with the Paris Agreement, President Nixon pulled out all the stops. And in a letter to President Thieu, he promised that if the North Vietnamese were to substantially violate the terms of the Paris Agreement, the United States would respond with full force. In other words, re-enter the war.
The North Vietnamese viewed Nixon as a madman. They were terrified of him. They believed that Nixon, if necessary, would bring back American air power. But in August 1974, he was gone. Nixon resigned because of Watergate. And overnight, everything changed. Hanoi suddenly saw the road to Saigon as being open.
The South Vietnamese population had ample reason to fear the Vietnamese communists. The communists' conduct throughout the course of the war had been violent and unforgiving. For example, when the city of Hue was taken over by the North Vietnamese, several thousand people on a long blacklist were rounded up. School teachers, government civil servants, people who were known anti-communists, and they were executed. In some cases, even buried alive. So panic was but a millimeter away.
Hundreds of thousands of refugees are in a blind rush to flee even further from the rapidly advancing communists. Bruce Dunning reports.
President Thieu broadcast a strong appeal to the soldiers and the people of Da Nang, urging them to stay and fight.
Và ngay cả vị tướng chỉ huy đó cũng không biết rõ ý định của ông Tổng thống Thiệu ra làm sao nữa. Và ngày hôm nay thì tin được lệnh là phải giữ Đà Nẵng. Ngày mai đã nhận được lệnh rằng bỏ.
As the enemy approaches, the panic has swept from the coastal city's crowded back streets and pagodas onto runways at the airport.
Our plane is surrounded here. I don't know how the hell we're going to get out. We're racing down the runway, leaving behind hundreds and thousands of people. Another dozen are there running along, grabbing at the air stair. We're pulling them on as fast as we can. There's a sea of humanity jamming on. Impossible to stop the crowd. We're pulling away. We're leaving them behind. We're pulling up with the people are falling off the air stairs. The plane is taking off.
It was every man for himself. So you saw the World Airways flight being mobbed by South Vietnamese soldiers. You saw ships with thousands of refugees, including lots of soldiers. You saw out-of-control panic. Basically, any boats, trucks, airplanes, or anything going south were besieged by people wanting to get on board.
The Americans were gone. And as a result, the house of cards began to collapse. The North Vietnamese decided to escalate at every turn to see if the United States would react.
In April of '75, I was with President Gerald Ford, and we were flying across the country on Air Force One when one of the airplane's crew comes and hands me a note, and it says, "Da Nang has fallen." Ford was bombarded by questions from the press after he got off Air Force One.
Around 150 to 175,000 well-trained North Vietnamese regular forces in violation of the Paris Peace Accords moved into South Vietnam. We have objected to that violation. It's a tragedy unbelievable in its ramifications.
We are now in a crisis. We had a wave of humanity, 500,000 refugees rolling south towards Saigon. And 160,000 North Vietnamese troops moving right behind them. I had become so concerned, I decided to pull our best Vietnamese agents in out of the woodwork to try to see what they could tell us about communist planning, which obviously was rapidly evolving. On the 8th of April, I met with one of our best agents who said, the communists are going to drive on Saigon. They're going to be in there by Ho Chi Minh's birthday, which was May 19th, literally a month away.
Communist forces in South Vietnam, already solidly in control of 11 provinces, began working on yet another one today, Binh Dinh.
Ở phía hải quân chúng tôi thì cũng không ai dám nói một lời nào về một cái chương trình gì sự xa xôi nữa, mà chỉ cố gắng bằng mọi sức bị chết. Và các cái dụng cụ không được thay thế. Nhiều các cái trại y tế dã chiến của chúng tôi phải dùng lại những cái bom băng. Thì đó là một cái trở ngại. Đánh tới đâu? Còn đánh được không? Hoặc là còn sức đánh không?
I kept a map every day on the progress of the North Vietnamese onslaught. By the 5th of April, the North Vietnamese had 15, even 16 divisions heading in the direction of Saigon. They were bringing SA-2 missiles down to provide anti-aircraft cover for their forces. There were people who were saying, look, we've got to do some heavy planning here, because depending on how this goes, and it doesn't look good now, we may all have to evacuate. And Ambassador Martin wouldn't tolerate or countenance such thought. That was defeatism. That was poisonous to the prospects of the people we're here to help. But people could see what was going on, and they started leaving, especially the Americans.
I'm leaving Vietnam. Why? I'm kind of scared, to be honest with you. Perfectly honest with you, I'm really scared. I think the situation's a lot worse than we know about.
There was always a standing evacuation plan in the embassy. It held that in an emergency, all Americans still in the country, about 6,000 people, would be evacuated, and that no South Vietnamese would be evacuated with them.
I was a student. The school is not closing, but it seemed like nobody interested in school anymore. You can't stay here. You can't live with the communists. Especially if you have a connection with the Americans, then you really got to get out.
If we really made up a list of endangered South Vietnamese, the ones who really worked closely with us during the war, this number could be 150, 200,000, including their families, many more than that. But the idea of talking about an evacuation and of planning for an evacuation of Americans let alone an evacuation of Vietnamese, was still anathema in the embassy.
If you mean that South Vietnam is on the imminent verge of collapse, I think the answer is quite definitely no. I mean,
we were dealing with an ambassador who was just convinced that somehow he was going to be able to pull this out and that there wouldn't have to be an evacuation and therefore there wouldn't have to be a concern about evacuating South Vietnamese.
The situation in South Vietnam has reached a critical phase, requiring immediate and positive decisions by this government. There are tens of thousands of South Vietnamese employees of the United States government, of news agencies, of contractors and businesses for many years, whose lives, with their dependents, are in very grave peril. I am therefore asking the Congress to appropriate without delay $722 million for emergency military assistance for South Vietnam. If the very worst were to happen, at least allow the orderly evacuation of Americans and endangered South Vietnamese to places of safety.
There was no way in 1975 that the Congress was going to vote any money to go to the aid of South Vietnam. We had pulled out our troops in 1973, and public opinion at that point shifted. The people of the United States, having seen Watergate, having seen the deception of the generals, weren't about to give any help in Southeast Asia. And, you know, Kissinger knew this.
We knew we were not going to get the $722 million. By that time, it made no big difference. But President Ford said he owed it to Vietnam to make a request.
We've sent, so to speak, battleship after battleship, and bomber after bomber, and 500,000 and more men, and billions and billions of dollars. If billions and billions didn't do at a time when we had all our men there, how can 722 million save the day?
This is the way my map looked in mid-April. The North Vietnamese just rolled down the coast. Saigon was clearly threatened. The situation was urgent. Urgent understates it.
At this time, Ambassador Martin had been back in Washington, trying to persuade Congress to vote additional aid.
He has no statement today.
He came back to Saigon, and my boss, the CIA station chief, said, "Go down and tell the old man what's happening." I went in and I said, "Mr. Ambassador, half of the South Vietnamese army has disintegrated. We're in grave trouble. Please, sir, plan for an evacuation. At least allow us to begin putting together lists of South Vietnamese we should rescue." And he said, "No, Frank, it's not so bleak, and I won't have this negative talk." Young officers in the embassy began to mobilize a black operation, meaning a makeshift underground railway evacuation using outgoing cargo aircraft that would be totally below the radar of the ambassador.
People like myself and others took the bull by the horns and organized an evacuation. In my case, that meant friends of mine who were senior officers in the South Vietnamese military. As the North Vietnamese came closer and closer to Saigon, these people were dead men walking. I had arranged a signal with my intelligence community friends that if I said I'm having a barbecue, that meant come to a certain pre-designated place and bring your families, and only bring one suitcase because we're going to have a party, but it was understood the party meant I was going to get them out. Black ops were essentially violating the rules. In this case, meaning you're not allowed to bring out Vietnamese military people who were under obligation to stand and fight. We were fully expecting if we got caught doing this that we would be run out of country. End of career, do not pass, go. But sometimes there's an issue not of legal and illegal, but right or wrong.
The deputy defense attaché moved out Vietnamese personnel and their families to Clark Air Base in the Philippines without any approval whatsoever, without any immigration papers, anything, passports, you name it. And when they began showing up in the Philippines, Martin hit the roof and fired him. But that didn't stop other State Department people who had Vietnamese friends and family members. They continued to organize these makeshift airlifts.
That April, I was in Kenta, which was about 100 miles from Saigon, and we were getting reports of this town falling and that province falling and so on. And then we were attacked. Sergeant Hasty came by to give me a report on the damage.
Canto came under pretty intense artillery bombardment. The North Vietnamese had overrun some South Vietnamese artillery batteries and managed to turn those around and shell the center of Canto. We knew that the situation was bad. We could see that the South Vietnamese army was eroding. Supplies had been cut off, and you could see the armaments dwindling.
We were, under the terms of the Paris Agreement, committed to resupplying the South Vietnamese. They lacked simple things like barbed wire and bags for sandbags. They were rationing their artillery shells because they were running out. The military support, the material support, was not coming.
When President Ford went before the Congress, he had two major concerns. The first was to save as many people as we could. He cared for the human beings involved. They were not just pawns that once they had lost their military power were abandoned. The second was the honor of America, that we would not be seen at the final agony of South Vietnam as having stabbed it in the back.
Congress wouldn't pass it. They said no more, no more troops, no more money, no more aid to the Vietnamese. Well, I had to go into President Ford's office to tell him. I had never heard Ford use a curse word in all the time I'd known him. But when I showed him this story, he said, "Those sons of bitches."
I think there were a total of 50 ships that were there. I mean, it wasn't just us. It was a whole bunch of ships. We were standing by for the evacuation of Americans. I was a terrible letter writer. I would write one letter for my wife's 10 letters, and she didn't like that. So she said, "We're going to exchange tapes." So I would run into my stateroom, turn the tape recorder on for a couple minutes, and tell her what's happening.
I really don't know where to start. It's been such an unusual couple days for us. We went with the rest of this huge task force of ours up to about 20 miles off the coast, basically east of Saigon.
as most Navy operations are, it was very carefully planned. We planned on the death.
The chain of command for, as I understood it as a captain of the United States Marine Corps, and I think I got it right, is for any evacuation, that decision is the ambassador's decision. Graham Martin is the responsible guy. But the military is responsible for giving him all kinds of plans. And this is how we got into the 4 options. The first option was you would take commercial ships right up the Saigon River to a couple blocks from the embassy. You would load whoever you wanted to bring out on these ships, and you'd be done with it. The second option was, you're United and Continental and Flying Tiger Airlines were still using Tonsanut Air Force Base at the time, and you could have brought anybody you wanted out by commercial aviation. The third option was military fixed-wing aviation. The C-5As, the C-141s, which carry a lot of people, you could have brought them out of Tonsanut on those. The very last option was helicopters off the carriers into Tonsanut Air Force Base. We had 75 Marine Corps helicopters out there. The helicopter option, that was absolutely the last resort. They don't go very fast, they don't carry that many people. That was if everything else failed.
I got into Vietnam late on the 24th of April, 1975. Saigon was full of rumor, of false stories, whether we were going to have a last attempt to draw a line across the country, and Saigon in the south would remain a free republic, all of these things, and it was all churning all around. The fighting was close to Saigon, but hadn't shown up in the streets of Saigon. I served as a naval officer and 3.5 tours in Vietnam, 2 of those years as a Special Forces advisor with a 20-boat river division, all Vietnamese. I could tell jokes and hear jokes in Vietnamese, and once you start off like that, you eventually end up being able to dream in Vietnamese. In 1975, my mission was to remove or destroy as many ships, swift boats, anything that I considered to be a benefit to the enemy. I met with Captain Do Kim, who was the operations officer of the Vietnamese Navy.
Ông ta nói rằng tình hình thì tuyệt vọng rồi. Bây giờ ông phải giúp tôi để làm một cái kế hoạch đưa các chiến hạm của Hoa Kỳ ra khỏi cái tầm tay của Cộng sản.
The plan was to sail all the large ships of the South Vietnamese Navy down the Saigon River to the sea and rendezvous at Con Son Island. We had to keep this secret. If word got out, it would have had an effect on the morale of the people in the street.
We knew that there were roughly 5,000 Americans still in the country. Many of them had Vietnamese wives, mistresses, whatever, just hadn't left. And they were basically letting us know we're not leaving without our families. Finally, we were given authority by the ambassador to bypass the immigration laws and send these Vietnamese out of the country. So then we started an operation basically to get out the Americans and their Vietnamese dependents.
It was not an official evacuation. We still had no organized plan for evacuating high-risk South Vietnamese because we had an ambassador who was making up his mind on the wing.
The president also asked Congress for authorization to use American troops here to evacuate Americans and Vietnamese who work for Americans.
If it were necessary.
You have plans for that?
Well, of course, every embassy in the world has plans for it.
You think it will be necessary?
That again, you see, is a judgment that I can't possibly make at this time. We have been reducing the population here as a measure of prudency, and we'll take measures to reduce it further as a question of prudence.
The ambassador was extremely skittish, and I guess understandably so, about talking about evacuation, about sending signals that an evacuation was being planned or even executed. He feared it would trigger a panic.
It's time to get out. And in Saigon at that time, it was like, who do you know? The key word would be connection. There's a lot of people, they try to get their money. Because if the people have money, maybe they will find connection to get out. You know, and so you want to go? Give me this kind of money. One guy said to me, your family, tell them to come to the boat dock. I was waiting for them. You know, of course, they took the money, but they never got us.
There was chaos in Saigon at that time. Everybody was looking for ways to get out as soon as possible. Of course, the Americans we worked with had a plan in place for us. They told us to get to the meeting place, which was a safe house, and near the American embassy, and to wait for buses to come to pick us up.
If we were going to get people out, we were going to have to make it happen and deliver the Vietnamese to the big airplanes in some form or fashion. And the only way we could do that was keeping the airport open as long as we could.
Ambassador Martin still hoped that somehow this thing would not end with the North Vietnamese humiliating the United States by attacking Saigon. But it seemed like the North Vietnamese had other ideas.
What may be the final battle of Saigon has begun. Communist ground forces have started moving in on Saigon's Tan Son Nhut Airport.
Rockets exploded all over the base, touching off 3 major fires.
The air base was under continuous artillery fire. I felt the rounds. They were so close. The shrapnel was clinking against the fence behind us. It was abundantly clear that it was a whole new ball game.
We never expected any trouble out there. And then, of course, fear a little bit set in because now we knew that it really meant business, you know. Were they going to continue shelling Tan Son Nhut? They're giving us a warning, you know. Get out.
As the sun came up, General Smith, who was our defense attaché out at Tan Son Nhut, contacted the ambassador and said, the plan to use the fixed wing to get a few thousand people out today isn't going to work. And we need to consider that this is it. Option 4, a heavy lift helicopter evacuation. And Ambassador Martin wouldn't hear of it. He said, I want to come out there. I want to see it. Which he did. He got in a sedan. He didn't lack for guts. There was still rounds coming in. Sporadic. but there was still artillery fire. And he could see that the main runway was full of craters from North Vietnamese artillery. And it was understood that General Smith was not being premature with the recommendation for Option 4.
Ambassador Martin's concern very clearly, up to now, was that once we start an official evacuation, it's pretty obvious that the game is over. You got to remember, this is an ambassador who had lost his only son in combat in Vietnam. One becomes pretty invested in that country. He had been holding out hope that some kind of third-party solution could be worked out so that South Vietnam could continue with some form of independence or autonomy. And he was being encouraged to think that this might be possible. But the morning of the 29th, he came to accept the fact that that wasn't going to happen.
And I picked up the phone and told Secretary Kissinger to inform the President that I had decided that we would have to go to Option 4.
When I tell President Ford the airport is being shelled, and I'd say it's now time to pull the plug, he keeps coming back time and again. You really think we have to do it? That's how heartbreaking it was for him. He finally, reluctantly, gave the go-ahead for the final evacuation.
This is the American Forces Vietnam Network.
The prearranged signal for the evacuation was broadcast on American radio in Saigon. The message was the temperature is 105 and rising, and then Bing Crosby's White Christmas. And sure enough, about 10 o'clock in the morning, I believe, on the 29th, there was Bing Crosby on the airwaves.
Of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know, where the treetops glisten and children listen to hear.
That morning, Ambassador Martin received a message that said, within 24 hours, the U.S. presence in Vietnam had to be closed out, meaning we had to be gone. It was obvious that there was the need for a hasty plan to be developed for a helicopter airlift out of the embassy to the fleet. And we had less than 24 hours to pull it off.
That morning, there must have been, I would guess, at least 10,000 people literally ringing the embassy. The embassy compound was the size of a city block. It was big. And all sides of it were filled 200-300 feet back. Fortunately, people were by and large very controlled. They were very patient. They were just hoping desperately to get in.
It's like the whole Saigon want to get inside the American embassy. So you have to know somebody, you know. Just like me, I find my friend and got this little paper to assure us to get in. So several of us went to the embassy. And my friend, he showed the paper to the guard, and he just kind of pointing it to each one of us, and we, one by one, just go inside the embassy. When I first got in, I feel so good. I in America, I almost there. They have a courtyard and a swimming pool, and we mostly gather around the swimming pool. and 1,000 people there. And they just keep coming in.
That morning, CIA choppers began picking up evacuees off the roofs of buildings around the city and bringing them to the embassy. There was an old pilot named Obie Harnage. He was blind in one eye and lame in one leg. And I said, Harnage, we got people at 6 Chalong. You got to go pick them up. It was the deputy CIA station chief's apartment building. There were a number of very high-risk Vietnamese, including the defense minister of South Vietnam, all waiting to be rescued. As they climbed up the ladder to the roof, a photographer took that famous photograph. Many people thought that was the U.S. Embassy. It wasn't. But it indicated to what extent chaos had descended on this entire operation.
Inside the embassy, everywhere we looked, was teeming with Vietnamese. We counted them. The total number was about 2,800. There was no hiding it that somehow people had to have let these people into the embassy. Was it, Marine security guards who kind of looked the other way? Was it American employees in the embassy who were doing kind of what we did with black ops and taking care of their own? We never got to the bottom of that. And frankly, we never pursued it.
One of my Marines said to me, we should take out the tailor. There was a tailor who made all our civilian clothes. So I said, why don't we take out the cook too? He said, well, you should take out the cook too, and all the other cooks. They should get out. They had business with Americans. So they took the bread truck and they rounded up the tailor, the cooks and the dishwashers, a few others, and their families, and drove them into the embassy compound.
There was in the parking lot of the embassy a great tamarind tree, which the ambassador had often referred to as steadfast as the American commitment in Vietnam. The CIA station chief that last morning said, Mr. Ambassador, we have to cut this tree down.
You could not land any large helicopters on the parking lot unless the tree and all the shrubbery was all gone. The ambassador had resisted us cutting that tree because he did not want anybody to be alerted that we were doing any sort of evacuation or were going to do any sort of evacuation.
He was upset, but finally he succumbed, to just common sense and gave up his, I guess you could call it a dream. And we cut it down.
He had also, over the past few days, prevented us from burning classified documents for fear that it would panic the South Vietnamese. So that morning of the 29th, we had thousands of pages of classified documents we had failed to destroy beforehand.
Our next job was just looking at that classified document idea and getting rid of that. So we went to every office and told them to start pulling stuff. And piles of paper began coming out. And we began shredding. There was a small building where we handled the pay for the Vietnamese who worked for the embassy. And in this building, there was over $1 million in U.S. currency. So we had to send a message to the Navy, who sent it to the Treasury Department, who came back and said, destroy it. So I assigned a few Marines to get rid of the money. And I said, oh, by the way, we're going to lock you in there. It took them 8 hours to burn $1 million.
That morning, Fear and desperation were the order of the day. But I had a job to do. It was an important job to do, I thought, to deny the enemy the South Vietnamese naval ships.
Thì ông nói rằng đại tá Kiểm, chậm lắm rồi, ông phải ra đi ngay. Thì lúc đó cái kế hoạch của chúng tôi là thứ nhất là bỏ hết tất cả các sự sửa chữa thông thường và chỉ chú trọng vào các cái bộ phận chính của một chiếc tàu, tức là máy tránh. Nếu mà một máy cũng tính là chạy được, thay vì hai máy, nhưng mà một máy chạy được cũng được, một máy điện cũng chạy.
We had expected, frankly, a longer time period to get ready. We had been told by people in our intelligence community that we might have as long as the 4th of May. But the North Vietnamese were closing in quite tightly, and clearly it was time to send the signal to leave.
Thì chúng tôi có chừng là khoảng 32 chiến hạm lớn, có 30 chiến hạm lớn có thể đi được. Cũng tính với lại ông Armitage rằng tôi sẽ cố gắng cho thủy thủ đoàn ra đi càng đông càng tốt. Thì tôi nói thủy thủ đoàn chắc chắn để đi, nhưng mà còn gia đình của họ sẽ không đi nếu không có gia đình họ đi theo.
I knew this, but I didn't know how many civilians were going to be on board. I had no idea.
Nó quá cái nhiệm vụ của tôi. Trên tôi còn có những người cao cấp hơn tôi. Tại sao họ không làm? Anh em mình cứ thấy rằng đó là cái nhiệm vụ của mình thì là làm.